Hello and welcome to this special edition of Dialogue, New Vision, New Mission. Members of the Standing Committee of the Political Bureau of the 20th Communist Party of China Central Committee met the press on Sunday after being elected at a plenary meeting. What is the mandate of the new leadership? How is China to realize the goal of building a strong modern socialist country? And what are the priorities and the characteristics of Chinese modernization? To find out more, I'm glad to be joined today by Victor Gao Zhikai, Chair Professor at Soochow University, Ryder, founder and CEO of Development Reimagined, Charles Liu, founder of HAO Capital and Senior Fellow at the Taihe Institute, and Josef Gregory Mahoney, Professor of Politics at East China Normal University. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to the discussion. Victor, I will start with you. Today, the Standing Committee of the Political Bureau of the 20th CPC Central Committee met the press. This is the highest decision-making body of the CPC. Explain to us the importance of this committee and how will it play a part in the Chinese policy for the next 5 years and beyond.
Yes, indeed. The first plenary session of the newly constituted Central Committee held its meeting today and made the very important decision to select new members of the Politburo and then the Standing Committee of the Politburo. We have 7 members of the Politburo, including 3 who were the members of the Standing Committee of the Politburo before, and then 4 new members of the Standing Committee who were originally the members of the Politburo. So everyone is familiar in Chinese politics at the very highest level, and it is important to emphasize that the Politburo, especially the Standing Committee of the Politburo, are really the core of the leadership decision-making, because you are talking about these 7 very important party leaders. Each will pick up a very important portfolio, including, for example, the premiership of the State Council, the chairman of the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress, the chairman of CPPCC, and several other very important positions. So when we look at these 7 faces, we know that these will be the most important leaders within the party and eventually in many other parts of the Chinese government, leading the whole nation going forward to do all the things that are important in front of us. And this will be a very united top leadership for the party and for the country for the coming 5 years.
Heine, during the meeting with the press, Xi Jinping, who was re-elected as the General Secretary of the party, talked about the twin miracles of China's rapid economic growth and the long-term social stability during the process of 40-plus years of reform and opening up. So tell us your understanding of the importance of stability, in particular for developing countries, in order to achieve a long-term development?
Well, in the words of the African ambassador to the African Union, who's based in China, development has really been a key aspect of Chinese economic miracles over the last 40, and I guess 20 years in particular, and it has made a particular difference to African countries. Look, we're in a time where Kristalina Georgieva from the IMF, just a few weeks ago, at the beginning of the annual meeting of the World Bank and IMF, talked about a darkening outlook. Various economic shocks. We have the coronavirus, Russian invasion of Ukraine, the high inflation, cost of living crisis, a number of challenges that the world is facing. And in this context, obviously, stability, continued growth is very important from China as a contribution to the multilateral system, not only for its own people. So I think if the new Politburo, the new party members can really make efforts to push China to continue to play this stable but growing role in the world, that could support growth globally over the next few years.
Yes, Professor Mahoney, Xi Jinping, during his brief remarks speaking to the press, he also stressed about these common values of peace, development, fairness, justice, democracy, and freedom. These terms are not exactly the same, as promoted by some Western countries. But for the absolute majority of the developing world, I think people understand peace and development are indeed critical, aren't they?
Well, these are promoted by other countries, but frequently without substance, unfortunately. For example, we know the U.S. often goes to war, sometimes preemptively, and sometimes lies to the United Nations about why it's necessary, as it did with Iraq, or it block builds and destabilizes regions, contributing to the current conflict in Ukraine, where the U.S. is now fighting a proxy war. We know that the U.S. has offered some development assistance to countries in the global south, but generally through some sort of quid pro quo, including the U.S. meddling in local politics. And quite often, the U.S. exploits, manipulates, or neglects developing countries, a point the West has acknowledged itself as it moves now to compete with China's development initiatives. Additionally, the U.S. promotes the idea of democracy abroad, but does a poor job of democracy at home. Further, when it forces what it calls democracy on others, those states frequently fail, as we saw recently in Afghanistan. And of course, the US doesn't actually promote democracy in international relations. It prefers a global system that it can dominate as a hegemon. Consequently, what can the US say about justice or freedom or human rights and so on? Now, China's position has been whole process democracy at home that leads to or helps create common prosperity, that lifts hundreds of millions out of poverty, that creates a population of more than 400 million middle income earners, that has eliminated extreme poverty. And internationally, China promotes win win, no strings development projects, promoting mutual recognition and respect, the conviction that development begins with security and human rights with subsistence. Now, these are the lessons China has learned from its own development over the past 40 years, and this is what it promotes abroad. Again, with the conviction that we can only move forward if we do so together, and we can only do so together if we share these kinds of baseline values.
Well, in terms of the China's relationship with the outside world, Charles, Xi Jinping also said, China's door to the outside world will only open wider and wider, that China will unwaveringly deepen reform and opening up in a comprehensive manner. What's your take on this statement?
I think, as the previous speaker had just stated, that China's growth and development over the course of the last 40 some years is a process of reform and opening up. Without this reform and opening up, China could not have achieved the miracle that it achieved in terms of economic development, lifting people out of poverty, and really contributing to global growth and global economic enhancements that seem not only in China, but also in many other countries. I think in terms of opening up and reform to be continued, to be opening wider, and reform to be deeper, this is a continuation of what has occurred over the last 40 years, 40 some years. In terms of opening up, it means greater commerce exchange, in terms of trade, in terms of technology exchange, in terms of culture, in terms of social contacts between the people. All of this has proceeded apace until recently, until the COVID-19 pandemic has hit, and the US targeting China in wanting to suppress China's continued development and growth. But that is only a temporary blip. I hope the opening up will continue. Reform, yes, the Chinese system of governance, of market forces, combination of the two, and planned economy is something that was really new at the beginning of reform and opening up. But this has to deepen in terms of accommodating changes in the global system and the Chinese state of economy. I think in terms of deepening reform, it would mean in the economic side, a better handling or the management and the regulations over the market forces and the societal needs, and the better meeting of the two sides in terms of market forces and planning. All of this is proceeding apace in China. And this is something that no one else has ever done before in human history. It's not easy, but hopefully it'll be successful at the party's as the Chinese economy continues to grow.
Well, Victor, of course, the outside world is following closely in terms of China's continuity with reform and opening up. And from the report delivered by Xi Jinping at the Congress, obviously people see the continuity and probably more than that, deepening of reform and opening up in a comprehensive manner.
Yes, absolutely. I think after the successful conclusion of the 20th Party Congress, the party leadership, China as a whole, the Chinese government, and the military will be more united than ever. And China will really be rededicating itself to reforms and opening to the outside world. Please keep in mind that China now is already the largest trading partner with more than 130 other countries and nations in the world. And China every year contributes to more than 35% to the additional GDP growth of the whole world. Therefore, the interconnection of the Chinese economy and the global economy is really of a very high degree, and neither can live without the other. And the greater exchanges between China and all the other countries and regions in the world is really for the greater mutual benefit. So I think when China becomes more flexible in dealing with this pandemic, for example, and more exchanges of goods, services, and technologies and people, for example, will take place after we become better in dealing with this pandemic, there will be a new momentum build up in promoting and increasing the exchanges between China on the one hand and all the other countries in the world on the other hand. So I think starting from next year, there will be a new wave, a new campaign of China's connectivity in a enhanced way with the rest of the world, rather than, as some countries in the West tend to believe, that they can cut off China from the global commerce, for example, or they can reconfigure the supply chain to the exclusion of China. I think those conspiracies and those schemes, first of all, will be proven to be futile and will fail, and then China will remain as a very important driver of global economic growth in the coming years.
Victor, Xi Jinping stressed that China, in the Chinese context, China is on a new journey to realize the goals of the second centenary, that is to build a modern socialist country and also the rejuvenation of the Chinese civilization through the Chinese path of modernization. Tell us more about that, the goal and the means.
Well, in China, we always talk about the two centenary goals. The first one was achieved last year. That is on the centenary of the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party of China. And then the second centenary will be celebrated in 1949, when the founding of the People's Republic of China will reach the 100th year. So we are talking about between now, 2022, all the way to about 2049 or 2050. Now, this will be very crucial. Several things will stand out. One is that the uplifting of the people. Originally, we want to uplift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in China. Now we want to further increase, the ranks and files of the middle class, because we have hundreds of millions of migrant workers moving from China's rural side of the equation to the urban side, and how to make sure that they will stay there as very meaningful contributing citizens and residents, for example, and their living standards and livelihood will be improved together with the rest of the population in China. This will be very important. Now, the second thing is that going forward, I think China will be better we have better and more clearly defined goals, because from now up to 2045, I think it is generally expected that the Chinese economy will not only be the largest in the world, and the Chinese economy will reach a very higher level of economic development with greater sustainability, and China will have much higher quality growth, meaning we were originally always talking about made in China, China being the workshop of the world, but going forward, we need to have more and more designed in China, invented in China, meaning we want to move from labor-intensive to technological intensive and capital intensive, for example, and you are talking about a whole range of things being done in a better way, in a more sophisticated way, and China as a country will climb up the technological ladder with greater focus on innovation, creativity, and entrepreneurship, and we will have not only national distribution networks, but increasingly international, overseas distribution network. And it may not just be Chinese-made distribution networks, it will be very much in cooperation with other existing networks. So the Chinese development in the coming decades, all the way up to the middle of the century, will truly be contributing to global trade, global commerce, and China will continue to be the major champion of globalization going forward in the coming few decades.
Well, Victor, thank you for joining us. Let's have a short break. We will continue our discussion right after this. Welcome back. If you look at what Victor has mentioned about innovation, according to Xi Jinping, he said that the innovation will remain at the heart of China's modernization drive. Given this pressure from Washington, for example, sweeping ban for the chips to the Chinese side, and other kind of tech war basically against the Chinese side, how important is it for China to focus on innovation and then to develop its economy and its technology?
Well, certainly it's very important, I think, in particular, in order to make sure that China has choices going forward and is able to determine the right technologies that it needs. I think this is what every single country would like. And many countries have had challenges in being able to address to ensure their own national security. We don't even need to look at technology to get to that, to get to understanding. We look at issues such as pharmaceutical manufacturing, where African countries, for instance, have faced huge challenges in being able to access pharmaceuticals in terms of to address COVID-19, to address vaccines. So the ability to be able to manage and provide your own security through innovating, through being able to make the kinds of things that populations need, not only in terms of manufacturing, but also in terms of the future of technology, where we're going, smart technology. All of these are very, very important, and they are a security question.
Charles, the U.S. is launching a tech war, sort of like Cold War in the tech sector against China. There's a lot of pressure on the Chinese side. Somehow China is forced to be more innovative, more relying on themselves. What are the advantages, China has probably in terms of, to be more innovative, in terms of having more innovation in technology sector?
There are two aspects to this. One is developing self-sufficiency in some of the critical sectors so that you would not have people choking you with technologies like the US is attempting to do now. So this is one side of it. In terms of that development, I think just look at what happened in terms of Chinese scientists and technicians and engineers. Growth has been really, really phenomenal and is really quite amazing. Moving from a country with a 10% literacy rate in 1949 to what it is today, the education system has done a phenomenal job, not only generally speaking, but also very specifically in science, engineering, in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. So as we all know, human capital is a critical component of innovation and technology development. And China has done a phenomenal job to build a basis so that it can have self-sufficiency if required. But of course, that self-sufficiency has to be coupled with global efficiency, which means a global supply chain. I think China has distinct advantages there because it is a major trading partner of, as Victor said, over 130 countries. But even more than that, I think the advantage of China in terms of being able to build self-sufficiency and to continue to grow its supply chain is also the size of its market. General Motors sells more cars in China than in the United States. 40% of sales of Volkswagen is in China. So that market in and of itself enhances efficiencies of scale. As we all know, those in business, the economy of scale makes a big difference in terms of your bottom line, in terms of your profitability. So I think China, given its market size, given its human capital, and of course, financial capital is now quite available in China as well. And the striving of the government coupled with the entrepreneurial spirit in the development of innovation and new technologies augurs well for China in this context.
Mm-hmm. Professor Mahoney, high quality development has been highlighted as the first and the foremost task in building a modern socialist country in all respects in the Chinese term. Tell us more about this attributes of high quality development. What is it? Why it is so important?
Well, China, over the course of much of its reform and opening up, it developed using polluting, what we might call dirty, low wage, low innovation methods, which could only allow it to rise to a certain level in order to meet the needs of people who now expect better standards of living, who now have higher educational levels, and indeed to meet the needs of a shrinking workforce in an extremely competitive global marketplace. China needs to focus on innovation. It needs to become an innovation hub where China invents, designs, and then earns as others did. And all the more so because we have these new strategies being deployed by the United States that aim to decouple China from high-tech innovation. China will have to cultivate a certain degree of autonomy in terms of its ability to produce what it needs, but also it wants to take a global leadership position in the global marketplace. And already on certain fronts, we see this happening, particularly in green technology and green development and other areas, including quantum computing. And China may stumble a little bit now with all the pressure that the U.S. is putting on it vis-a-vis chips. But I am one of those who believes that China's incredible organizational capacity, its system, which is designed to meet these types of crises and challenges, and has frankly met much bigger and more difficult challenges than these in the past. I think it will more than adequately rise to the occasion.
Mm-hmm. Well, Hannah, there are 5 features or characteristics of the Chinese-style modernization. Of course, it's modernization in terms of the commonality with the modernization in other parts of the world. But there is something more to that. Chinese side stress that this is the modernization of 1.4 billion people, or modernization of common prosperity for all. There's emphasis on the people. It's not about like 20%, 1% of this population enjoying the privileges of modernization. It's about everybody here. It's sort of like reflecting the thought of people-centered governance, people-centered thought, as well as probably the poverty alleviation and the common prosperity for everybody.
Well, of course, what we've seen over the last 40 years is effectively what I would call China's marathon in poverty alleviation and poverty reduction. And we've had China reaching the milestone a few years ago on managing to eradicate rural. At the same time, of course, if the country is not trying to make sure that wealth is well distributed, that will create its own social problem. And we see those in many countries. We see that sharp inequality between people, creating social challenges. So having gone through managing to eradicate rural poverty, now the biggest issue, of course, for China is how to make sure that wealth is distributed as equally as possible. Make sure that people feel that their economy is an economy that they can benefit from, that they can be as entrepreneurial, that they can get something from, that they can believe in for their children as well. So I think that is going to be now the biggest challenge, and modernization, the kinds of economic policies that are being discussed, the push on innovation, the push on further modernization is obviously going to be very key to that. But the biggest question is going to be how to distribute it, and of course, if the government remains steadfast on that, I'm sure that will be very crucial.
Professor Mahoney, the Chinese modernization is also of material and cultural ethical advancement, as well as harmony between humanity and nature. What do you make of that kind of emphasis in terms of the feature of the Chinese modernization?
Well, I think one of the things that President Xi has wanted to illustrate is that the Chinese path is quite different from what was pursued by other countries, particularly those in the West. We know that Western modernization did not develop according to these 5 features. Rather, it proceeded from a very difficult period starting in the 1500s with the rise of the nation state, interstate war. It coincided with imperialism, colonialism, slavery, genocide. It sparked regional wars, global wars, and cyclical cycles of economic collapse, including the Great Depression, which then coincided with other great tragedies. So, I think that when we look at the history of this type of development in the Western world, in tandem with the what experts call the rise of the Anthropocene, the science of climate change, which correlates with the rise of the West, the Industrial Revolution, and so forth and so on, that these were self-destructive paths. They're certainly not the type of path China would like to repeat. And it's certainly not the type of path that the world can afford to repeat at this time. And China's saying, we'd very much like to do something different. Now, we know that China was forced to modernize, that this was something that was brought to its shores, particularly following the aggression of the Opium Wars in the 1840s, and continuing all up until liberation in 1949. Suffering through the difficulties associated with the Japanese invasion and other issues. So, we know that China has been forced to modernize as quickly as possible, to take an accelerated and sometimes dangerous path, which proved very disruptive to society and environment, and sometimes concentrating some of the worst features of the Western model in a compressed period of time. But now that China has closed the gap, now that it's secured itself and its sovereignty, it now can focus on building and in some cases rebuilding core civilizational values, including those that we see expressed in the 5 features.
5 features of the modernization, which is also of peaceful development. Well, with that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app or on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.